The information found in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Hi, and welcome to the Women in Depth podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Lourdes Viado. Join me as we explore the inner lives of women, their struggles, fears, hopes, and dreams. We'll go beneath the surface and take a deeper look at what is hidden, unknown, uncertain, and uncomfortable. Hi, and welcome back to the podcast. Today, I'm very excited about my guest and our topic. We're going to be talking about highly sensitive persons who have had the experience of complex trauma, or we also call it in the therapy world, complex PTSD for complex post-traumatic stress disorder. I know that's a mouthful, but today my guest, Carmen Schmidt Benedetti, and I are going to delve deeper into this area and explore why this is so important to really look at how trauma affects highly sensitive individuals and what this means for the treatment of highly sensitive individuals, and also just to help those of you who are highly sensitive or have a loved one who's highly sensitive to better understand and support yourself or this person in your life who has this beautiful gift of high sensitivity. Carmen Schmidt Benedetti is a psychotherapist for highly sensitive women in Sonoma County, California. She helps them to heal layers of unrecognized childhood trauma and create calm, balance, and stability in their life. As a certified EMDR therapist, Carmen guides adults in reframing their past from an empowered perspective, coming to believe they are good enough and their needs and feelings matter. Hi, Carmen, and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Lourdes.
I'm very excited about our conversation and looking forward to really exploring this topic because as a highly sensitive person and a therapist who works with HSPs and childhood trauma and complex trauma, this is a big topic. Not that it's not big for those who are not highly sensitive, but there are some important significators to take into account when you're dealing with high sensitivity and trauma.
Definitely. I was thinking the same thing of what a big topic this is.
So we're going to do our best with this huge topic, and hopefully at the end of our conversation, our listeners will have some insights and information to help them on their way.
Yeah.
So Carmen, can you just please share a little bit about how you ended up with this niche, this area of working with highly sensitive individuals and complex trauma?
Yeah, I'd love to. I think when I first started practicing therapy, a lot of clients were coming in and they would explain their symptoms and were trying to, that's kind of what they're wanting to do is how do I deal with these symptoms? And I often found myself kind of digging around in their past and making connections to their past and their present behaviors and experiences. And when doing that, I often found many of my clients had experienced ongoing trauma throughout their childhood, or they had had several incidences of trauma throughout their life. And I realized I don't just want to focus on clients' symptoms and how to manage them. I think that that's really important and imperative for the work that we're doing because they have to be able to function better. But it felt like in doing that, if we just do that, it puts a Band-Aid on the issue, but doesn't address really the root cause. So they're going to continually have to manage the symptoms, but not really resolve what was causing it in the first place. I also, in recent years, personally discovered that I'm a highly sensitive person. So when I first started to learn about it, I was recognizing there's these things in my life areas of my life where I've felt different, and I couldn't quite pinpoint why. And when I learned this about myself, it really helped validate me and know like I am different, but now I understand why. And there's nothing wrong with me. It's just a difference that I have. And there's so many gifts that come along with it to being an HSP. And I feel really grateful for that. So also then started to see it in my clients once I learned about it myself. I think it's likely kind of why they were drawn to working with me, because of these similarities and traits and just how I understand them well and why we work so well together. I really find that HSPs seem to be perceptive and self-aware and very insightful, and they're really excited and willing to dive deep with me, as I was saying, as I go digging around there, and they really seem to thrive in therapy.
When I was talking to Julie Bieland several episodes ago, she had actually shared the statistic that 50% of clients in therapy are highly sensitive.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. My guess is that it's because they're more drawn to doing that work.
Yeah, absolutely. And once she told me that and I started to really look at my clients, it was apparent that, at least for me, at least half of my clients are highly sensitive. And even as they would be coming in for, whether it was anxiety or depression or trauma, it was interesting how just the education about the trait was so important, similar to what you're saying about first we have to help them be able to function and then we can go deeper, but just finding out what it meant to be highly sensitive and to learn about how to manage their trait, I think is a large part of helping them to function better as well.
Absolutely, because it just really helps validate their experience and then recognize what are some of the challenges they're having because of that trait and how they can adapt once they learn why they're having that challenge. And then also be able to recognize the strengths and use that to their advantage.
So I like to start with the building blocks each episode, just because we may have listeners who this is their first time hearing about this trait. So can you please share, what does it mean when we say that someone is highly sensitive?
Yeah, that's an important question. So people can kind of get a sense of, what are you talking about even?
Right. Exactly.
So one phrase that I hear frequently to describe a highly sensitive person is that they have a finely tuned nervous system. And I really like that because it touches on a lot of aspects of being highly sensitive. An HSP, for short, is more impacted by sensory information. So kind of like their five senses, right? And I like to think of it as they're taking in more information than a non-HSP in a lot of different ways. That's sensory information, but they also process and feel more deeply and intensely. And they also tend to be overwhelmed and overstimulated more easily by both the emotions and the sensory information. They're also very perceptive, emotionally, energetically, and to their physical surroundings. They tend to pick up on subtleties and nuances that non-HSPs might miss. So things like they're very attentive to details. They'll pick up on facial expressions or body language, or just kind of have like a sense of something. And an example of that might be, I have clients when I've like moved something in my office, they're the first to notice. They're like, was that in a different place before? Yes, And they also have a really strong sense of empathy. They can really like connect with other people and feel it. Additionally, they tend to be really conscientious, meaning both about their own mistakes, but also about how they impact other people. Just very aware of their impact on others, which can sometimes be hard for them, because they might expect others that are non-HSP to be just as conscientious and sort of offended when they're not. An HSP, it's very obvious, but a non-HSP, it's not necessarily in their awareness. So something, I guess, that comes to mind as an example of that would be someone in the grocery store and they're blocking the aisle with their cart and they're just not paying attention. And an HSP might get frustrated with that. Like, how could they not be aware that other people are behind them or needing to get by? Because from an HSP perspective, they are very aware of things around them and are paying attention to like, how am I going to impact others in this scenario? And being, conscientious of how that would feel for someone. And they just tend to make a lot of connections and tend to be very intuitive.
I laughed when you said that comment about your office
Mm-hmm.
because I usually use the same essential oil blend all the time. And there was a time when I ran out of one of the essential oils that I put in this blend.
Mm-hmm.
And my highly sensitive clients immediately could tell there was something different
Yeah.
about the smell, or even very aware of the temperature in the room and subtleties like that. I think too, just when you were talking about making the connections, it's also why it's so exhausting sometimes, I feel, for highly sensitive individuals, because not only are they taking everything in, they're connecting it to so many other things. So their brains are just working so hard that it actually can cause them to appear as if they're not really present or they're not paying attention, but there's just so much going on in their heads.
Yes, that's that deep processing, right? Where they're
Right.
taking it all in. Like you said, they're not just taking it in, they're also like analyzing it and figuring out, what do I do with this information?
Yeah. Could you also share, Carmen, what are some of the maybe myths about high sensitivity or misperceptions?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things that comes up often, and especially in relation to us talking about trauma, is that sometimes people think trauma causes high sensitivity. My guess around this is probably because they both relate to the nervous system, but actually high sensitivity is an innate genetic trait. So someone's born with the traits. It's not something causes it. So that's a common misconception that people have around high sensitivity. The other piece is that it's not a diagnosis or a disorder. So high sensitivity is, as I mentioned, a trait. And it can just be kind of confusing because it's also sometimes called sensory processing sensitivity. So again, it's just something someone is born with and not like a disorder. There's some things that can be challenging about being highly sensitive, but it's not something that you could diagnose someone with. And there's a lot of benefits to it as well.
I'm glad you mentioned that about the sensory processing disorder, because I know that's also a very common misperception that it's the same thing.
Yeah, they sound so similar, disorder and sensitivity. I think that sometimes people get confused by those terms.
Yeah, and especially because there is this, this sensory component to high sensitivity. However, there's so much more beyond that as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you know about, I guess, what's the percentage of the population that is highly sensitive?
It's about 15 to 20%.
Okay. And I believe, too, that it's been found in like 100 other animal species, which I thought was fascinating.
Yeah, I have heard that in the research.
Yeah. I was reading Elaine Aron's book on psychotherapy with highly sensitive persons. It was just amazing to see all the anecdotes about for example, she described some type of fish in a pond, and that the highly sensitive fish would tend to kind of stay to the edges of the pond. Mm-hmm. And the fish that they would call the bold fish, which I guess were not the highly sensitive fish, would be more out there close to the surface. And they did some kind of study where they put some bait or a trap on the water, and they noticed that the bold fish went for it right away. And the highly sensitive fish hung back at the edges to kind of just see how is this going to unfold. They were able to replicate this study in the lab where they took the fish, brought them to the lab, did the same thing in a pond that was created, and they still did the same thing. And so one of the things that I thought was fascinating about this is how high sensitivity also has helped species to evolve by helping them to the way that they respond to danger. And I think this is that cautious aspect of many HSPs where there's this sense of holding back, not a lot of impulsivity.
Yeah, very observant and taking in all that information of okay, how can I approach this? Or being very thoughtful in what they say and do.
So, Carmen, let's go ahead and segue now to trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And just like with the HSP stuff, I want to start with some of the building blocks, because again, maybe there are people in our audience who aren't really sure what we are talking about when we say trauma.
Yeah.
Which makes sense.
Yeah.
It's a word that has a lot of misconceptions.
Absolutely.
I'd like to start with just differentiating what is complex trauma and how is it different from other trauma that we talk about in the therapy world.
Okay. So first I'm going to kind of define trauma itself, I think, and talk about a little bit about, generally speaking, what that is, and then kind of break it down a little bit further.
Okay.
A traumatic incident would be one in which someone experiences or witnesses or even learns about where there is some sort of perceived or actual threat to your sense of safety or someone else's safety. So that's kind of a broad idea of what something that's considered traumatic. And most people, when they think of trauma, what comes to mind is something like a dangerous or life-threatening event or experience, like a serious car accident or going to war or sexual or physical assault or like a natural disaster. Those are often times people can resonate with those things, with the idea of trauma. There's also trauma with things that are maybe a little bit seemingly smaller. I say that because it's so subjective and depends on the impact someone has or those things have on someone. So with layers, they can have just a great of an impact on someone's well-being if it's accumulated over time. So that might be things like big changes or difficulties that are distressing in some way. So death of a loved one, losing a job, stress at work, maybe that's an ongoing thing, financial problems, breakups, those kinds of things. So although those things aren't dangerous necessarily, they might relate to feeling safe in the world or like that ongoing feeling of stress that can just cause problems in everyday functioning and make it difficult to deal with. So that would be something that would be regular PTSD, could be developed. That being said, two people, they might go through the same traumatic experience. And one person might develop PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, while one person might not. So sometimes that can be confusing of, well, how could that be, two people going through these same things, but they're going to be impacted differently by them. So the difference might be that if someone's nervous system can integrate and process the information from that experience, or if it gets kind of stuck or locked up in your system is kind of the way I like to describe it. So aspects from the memory can get kind of fragmented and is why people develop symptoms and feel triggered. So something subtle could remind them, or not so subtle, could remind them of an experience. And this might be in their conscious awareness and it might not. And it just activates that part of the brain where the memory is stored. And sometimes it can feel like they're re-experiencing it all over again. The same emotions or images come to mind or body sensations, those kinds of things. It just feels like they're there again and they might not even know why.
I'm glad that you mentioned the aspect of this might not even be in the individual's conscious awareness, because often I know that when I work with clients and we're trying to understand where a reaction is coming from, it takes some deep exploration to trace that thread back to another time that's almost like a deja vu for our psyches, where we don't see it in that immediate moment that this looks just like a dangerous situation that was interpreted by my brain as dangerous when I was 7 or 10. But it's like a emotional memory that you're experiencing, but you're experiencing it in the present.
Yes, exactly. Because your brain is kind of going there.
Right.
And lighting up, I guess that part of the brain is kind of how I like to describe it.
Yeah.
But it feels very real.
One of the questions that I like to play with when we're trying to do this work is, when have you been here before? When have you had this same feeling, this tightening in your stomach, or this fear of humiliation, or this panic? And it'll be interesting. I remember when I was 8 years old. And so it's very interesting what, I guess, these present moment symptoms or responses, what those threads lead back to when you're able to follow them.
Yes. And I think that the example that you gave is a good example of more of the complex trauma.
Yes. Yeah.
Because as I mentioned with those other experiences, that would be the more general PTSD. But complex trauma is just that, complex.
I think I got ahead of you.
It's very complicated because what's different about this is, one, it's kind of like what causes it can be different, as well as how it shows up. But in terms of what causes it, before I was talking about experiences that sometimes they can be ongoing, but especially with complex trauma, it's a more like enduring exposure, like over a longer period of time. So there's no endpoint to it. It's just not known. It's someone's continually going through it. Oftentimes that's in childhood. There can be other experiences that lead to complex trauma, like domestic abuse, relationship in adulthood, or living in a war zone and those sort of things. But because of my background experience, I'll speak mostly to what I most see, and that is those relationships with like early caregivers in childhood, especially, and the impact that those relationships have. Now, with something that occurs in adulthood, I'll also add that sometimes, unless they have past experience with trauma, which may be the case, adults are going to have more tools to deal with difficult experiences than children. So children really have to rely on others for their safety and to be taken care of and their needs met. And they don't really have as much control. So it's going to impact them differently. And we often, as I mentioned, rely on our caregivers, oftentimes our parents, to take care of us. But when they're not available or they're hurtful physically or emotionally, then we have to learn to adapt to that. So sometimes a child will learn their needs aren't going to get met, so they might shut down to survive, thinking like, if I don't have needs, then I won't be disappointed when they're not met. And a child, especially a highly sensitive child, might start to become the caretaker. That's kind of a common trait for some HSPs, just because of their empathetic nature. But then sometimes they start to neglect their own needs and feelings to kind of care for others. And so sometimes this makes it hard to identify, because it's not necessarily like a one experience sort of thing. And it might get minimized because their feelings and needs might go unrecognized. So sometimes in these relationships in early childhood, there can be continual violations of some kind, or disappointments, embarrassments, ignoring or shaming. And so it can be difficult when those early relationships don't feel safe and secure. And it really can create this sort of conflict internally between like, oh, I really need this person and I want to be close to them, but I also need to be safe, and not really being sure if it is safe based on how that person, especially a parent, might respond. So then beliefs can kind of develop around like, it's not safe to be connected or depend on other people. They'll let me down, or like, I can't rely on and trust them. And yet at the same time, I have to rely on this person for my survival. So I can't lose them, even if they hurt me or they don't meet my needs. And it just really creates these confusing messages about how to be or what it means about them. So they have to adapt to their situations. I got to do whatever I can to make sure I don't lose them. Being the good girl, or being perfect, or not make a mistake. Don't want to upset mom or dad, so they'll love me.
So Carmen, what is the significance of complex PTSD for those who are highly sensitive? Why is this a big deal? Not that it's not a big deal for others, but what is it about the trait that makes complex PTSD kind of a different animal when we're looking at its impact for highly sensitive individuals?
That's a really great question. So one thing that comes to mind is HSPs experience the world differently. So they're going to experience trauma differently. And HSPs are more susceptible to being impacted by trauma and developing PTSD or complex PTSD, because it impacts the nervous system. Like any kind of trauma impacts the nervous system. And an HSP already has a sensitive nervous system. So that's going to affect them more. And their environment really has an impact. Just as we were talking about like those subtleties in the office and that kind of thing, the environment an HSP is in is really going to affect them. So they could get overstimulated more easily. And if you think about how that relates to sense of safety, and so really is core to feeling safe, is having an environment that is maybe not as overstimulating, and finding ways to soothe and have needs met. And I think especially for HSPs, like that can often go maybe unnoticed or can be dismissed of, oh, you're being too sensitive or taking that too personally, right? And with this susceptibility piece and this nervous system piece, kind of like a metaphor I like to use is everyone else is walking around with a suit of armor, and an HSP might have a thinner layer of armor, but an HSP with trauma has no armor unless they learn to create it themselves through awareness and education and tools. They can build up their armor. Like, it's not like if they're an HSP and they have trauma, they won't ever have that. It's just if that's the case, where they're not learning those things from the start, then that's how it's going to feel.
I really love that metaphor. That's a good one, for just getting a sense of how highly sensitive individuals are moving through the world, that just don't have as thick of a protective layer, if any.
Yes.
What are some of the, unique aspects of how HSPs may experience trauma? And you've alluded to some of these already, but I was wondering if maybe there are some experiences or observations that you can share from, your work in this area beyond what you've already shared.
Yeah. So I think one of the biggest pieces that can come up with complex trauma is the difficulty with emotional regulation. And that just is a good tie-in to what we were just talking about with the armor, right? Because being able to manage and control emotions can be especially true for HSPs since they're experiencing feelings more intensely. So again, if someone doesn't soothe them or model to them how to deal with them, then they're going to not know, what do I do with all these really big feelings? And so oftentimes in talking about emotional regulation, I like to talk about the idea of the window of tolerance, which relates to the nervous system. And this is a range in which you can manage what's going on and process and integrate information. So when someone is outside of their window, they cannot think and feel at the same time. So it's difficult for them to problem solve or to think clearly. And when you're outside your window, you can kind of go on two ends of a spectrum. One is hyper arousal, which means things like overstimulation, overwhelm, anxiety, panic. And on the other end is hypo arousal, which looks like numbness, depression, shutting down, checking out, freezing up. And so kind of in relation to that armor metaphor, from my perspective, an HSP has a narrower window since they're more overwhelmed by stimuli and just those intense feelings that they have. And then when you add in trauma, it shrinks that even more. They have less of a range in which they can get thrown out of their window. And it's just easier to get off balance. So with practice, they can expand their window just by learning signs that they're out of it or what triggers them, and be proactive in recognizing what their needs are so that they don't become overstimulated or overwhelmed, and how to get back into their window. So that's one really big part of complex trauma and how that shows up and how that might be especially true for HSPs.
When you were discussing the window of tolerance, it made me think of Dr. Jennifer Sweeten's book, The Trauma Treatment Toolbox. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but she uses the same concept, and she calls them the degrees of freedom.
Oh, what a great concept.
And so what she has in her book is there's a thermometer, and it goes up in degrees of like 10, 20, 30, 40. And part of the work is kind of discovering what your boiling point is. So next to each degree on the thermometer, you write down, like if it's like 70 degrees, situations, people, memories where you felt like your temperature was 70 degrees. And then your boiling point is the number that you feel describes where you're not able to cope healthily with whatever is happening. You're just overwhelmed, and you're not able to utilize any tools or techniques to help yourself to calm your nervous system. And then at the bottom, she has your freezing point, which is, I think, what you described, like the hypoarousal, the numbing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And, she describes it as not everyone has a freezing point, but some people do have one where they can be too relaxed. or too calm to function. So it becomes about identifying your degrees of freedom and learning how to stay in that window and getting to this practice of being able to take your temperature. So when you had this disagreement with your boss, what do you think your temperature was at? And if their boiling point's 85, maybe they'll say I was at 80. And so knowing that if you're at 80, what tools can you use to bring you closer to neutral, and neutral being 50?
Yes, exactly. You got to find the things that work for you. And like being that awareness piece is so important. Like I like that she has that giving examples and identifying how does it feel and what do you notice? Because the more you can be aware of it, then the more you can do something about it.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that you brought up the emotional regulation piece with this, because I think that that is the biggest aspect of the treatment, at least getting to a place of functioning. Because again, if you're overwhelmed or underwhelmed, you're not able to cope.
Yeah, I always have to kind of start there with my clients is like, okay, we got to get you to a place where you can think and feel at the same time so you can tolerate things and manage it. Otherwise, it's going to be really hard, especially if we're doing trauma work when it might bring up some big feelings, being able to trust themselves and being able to manage the feelings as they come up.
Another piece that I like to bring up with the big feelings is I want to remind highly sensitive individuals, my highly sensitive clients, and to anyone who's listening that the flip side of all of this is that highly sensitive individuals who are able to learn techniques for coping, who are better able to understand the way they're wired, they can really thrive.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I feel like highly sensitive individuals, like you said, they're drawn to therapy. They do really well. They do really well in therapy when they're able to understand themselves, understand the trait, learn techniques for managing the big emotions. And so I also want to emphasize that there is a bright light at the end of the tunnel.
Yes, absolutely. They can definitely flourish in their healing.
So, Carmen, if there is someone who's listening and this is really resonating with them and they are struggling with overwhelm, they've experienced trauma and they're wondering, I may be highly sensitive. What are your suggestions for them as they begin to move forward with this self-understanding and this healing?
Well, part of that I would say is probably one of the best ways to help support your growth and healing is to get into therapy, because you could have support along the way and help navigate through it, especially something like complex trauma. And some of the things you can do either in therapy or on your own as well is things like practicing self-compassion, learning some mindfulness and grounding tools to kind of learn to soothe yourself and stay present, learn more about how the traits of HSP impact you, and understanding more about trauma, just kind of education, I think is really key. Better being able to recognize your needs and feelings. And I think boundaries is a big area as well, setting and maintaining them, and sort of reparenting yourself. That's the phrase that I like to use, of kind of meeting the needs that weren't met growing up. A lot of this can be done in therapy. And I think, like you were saying, just how much HSPs can benefit from that, because I really do think their sensitivity gives them an advantage. Because just as they're more susceptible to being affected by negative events like trauma, they're also more impacted by positive experiences.
Absolutely, yeah. And Carmen, can you speak a little bit about the importance of highly sensitive persons seeking a therapist who is informed, aware, or has expertise in this trait?
Absolutely. I think that it can be so important that someone is knowledgeable about HSPs in therapy to better be able to distinguish the traits and really understand the person, because an HSP can often get misdiagnosed since their sensitivities could be perceived as something else when the therapist isn't necessarily aware of what high sensitivity is or how these traits impact someone. So a therapist who's knowledgeable really can understand these things and discern the traits from other symptoms. And I think it's especially important for an HSP to feel understood, because likely most of their life, they maybe have not felt that. And especially if they've experienced trauma. So one of the most important things is that a client feel comfortable with their therapist. And I think especially as an HSP, to feel comfortable, you want to feel understood. And if it's not a good experience, or someone's invalidated or doesn't feel understood, then it's just going to sort of reinforce that belief that, something's wrong with me. And then they might not want to try therapy again. Like, it can be really discouraging. So a therapist that's knowledgeable is really going to kind of cater their approach to better fit with the needs of an HSP and really take that into consideration in adapting their work.
Carmen, what are some websites or books or other resources that you recommend for those who are wanting to learn more about the trait of high sensitivity and also about trauma? So some of the resources that with HSP, the main one that comes to mind is hsperson.com. That's Elaine Aron's website, who did the original research on highly sensitive persons. She's really got a lot of great information there. And in terms of trauma, a really great book that I often recommend is The Body Keeps Score by Bessel van der Kolk. And we'll include those links in the show notes. And I agree with you. I believe that hsperson.com, which is Elaine Aron's website, is an excellent beginning point. And there's a lot of information, a lot of free stuff. And there's also a questionnaire that you can take if you're not sure, if you're highly sensitive, to get a sense of if you have many of the qualities of the trait. Yeah. And Carmen, what is the best way for our listeners to learn more about your work, to get in touch with you, and possibly set up a consultation to work with you?
Yeah. So probably the best way is to reach me on my website at carmenschmidtmft.com. So you can go on there if you have questions or want information. And I see clients in California, but people can also reach out outside of California, and I can provide some other resources if they just let me know.
Okay, and we'll make sure to put your information in the show notes so that listeners can find you easily. And Carmen, thank you so much for spending this time with me today and sharing your expertise. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation and was inspired by your work. I learned a lot, and I'm excited to share this with the world.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a great time with you.
Take care.
You too.
Thanks so much for listening to the Women in Depth podcast. I hope it brings you a deeper understanding of yourself and others, and that you found some insights that illuminated and inspired. If you like what you hear, please consider supporting Women in Depth with a one-time or recurring donation. Any amount is appreciated and helps us continue to provide free, quality content for the world. If donating resonates with you, you can find the donation link on today's show notes. You can also follow Women in Depth on Facebook and YouTube, and if you haven't yet, please subscribe on iTunes. Again, thank you so much for listening, and see you next time.